I'm Nicole, and in this video we're going to be making one of my favorite Studio Ghibli characters, which is Calcifer. There's so much amazing fan art of this character, and I really wanted to add my own. We're going to start off with some super Sculpey medium. There's directions right on the back, they're pretty simple to follow, and it's pretty easy to use once you know some tricks. The first one's going to be make sure you condition your clay very well. After conditioning our clay, we're going to move on to the armature of the log that Calcifer is going to sit on. Your armature helps your piece not crack while it's baking in the oven. I'm just making it into a log shape, and then I'm going to cover it with some clay. I'm just cutting the pieces of clay to size and then wrapping it up like a little tiny burrito. Once we have our burrito, I just cut off any excess. And now we want to make it look a little bit more like a stump. I'm just using my flat surface to help me get some flat edges. And then I want to add a little branch to make it a little more realistic. So I'm just using a smaller piece of clay and cutting the shape out. Here I'm just using a tool to help me blend the two pieces together really well so that it doesn't fall off or break off after baking. You can also add a little bacon bond when you attach the piece, and that'll really make sure that it's secure. Now we want to make this look like an actual log, and we're going to start adding some fun details. I like to use this ball stylus and just make some fun little swirls that are the rings of our tree. And here you can see it's looking much more logish, but it needs a little more dimension. So I'm going to use some extra pieces of clay, roll them out, and add them to the ends of the log so it's a little more flared and it looks a little more realistic and not so boring. I'm just making sure that it's really blended in so it doesn't look like we just slapped some clay at the bottom. And I'm blending the inside part as well. Now we can move on to the fun stuff, which is texturing and making this look like a real tree log. I like to flare the bottom a bit, it just makes it look more realistic. Now I'm going to start adding those lines. Really easy to do with this needle tool. I'm just going through and making sure I have really nice details and texture and cracks everywhere. Make sure you get your little tree branch part that's sticking out as well. And it's starting to look much more like a log, but I feel like it needs some texture. And what I use for that is going to be an old electric toothbrush head. I know it sounds weird, but it makes really great texture. Honestly, anything can be a tool, as long as it works. Here I'm just using those bristles to add some nice rough texture for all that bark. If you mess up any of your lines, you can go through and clean them up after. Now Calcifer is a fire demon, which means he's burning the wood, so I want to add a little bit of char detail on the log as well. I just looked up some references. Now it started out looking a little bit like runes, but I get it together, don't worry. Now that our piece is done, I like going over it with some Sculpey clay softener. This gets off any fingerprints, any lint or dust, and it just blends everything together so nicely. Be careful not to use too much or you can wipe away all your texture. So nice soft strokes and just a little bit of clay softener. Now, even though I used the armature, I did have some breaks here, and that's because I did not pay attention to my oven temperature and it went too high and caused these cracks. But I'm going to show you how to fix it. Ironically, using something called Fix-It Sculpt. This is a 2-part epoxy clay and it's really awesome to work with. You can make entire sculptures out of just this stuff, but you just mix 2 equal parts together. You get this kind of softer clay, and I just push it into where the cracks are. And I use a little bit of safety solvent, which is kind of like clay softener, but for this type of clay. And I smooth it out and you won't ever know those cracks were ever there. Now we're going to start making the armature for Calcifer. I know he looks a little bit like Pac-Man mixed with a Hershey Kiss, but just stick with it. I promise it's gonna work out. Even I was a little worried, but it works out. I'm gonna cover our little Pac-Man in polymer clay. I'm just using a roller to get a nice even sheet, and then I'm just covering up all that tin foil. And now that I'm going to bake this guy correctly, there won't be any cracks. I'm just fitting it onto our log and kind of figuring out the shape as I'm going along. You're gonna have to mess with it a bit. You're gonna go through an ugly stage. Don't worry about it. Everything looks a little weird before it starts looking good. Now I'm going to be using a Lazy Susan for sculpting this. You don't have to, but I really like it because I can move the piece around, see if it's even, add more clay. So here you can see I'm adding more clay to the bottom and the back and building it up into this shape. And we're going to start off strong with the booty crack, the most important part of Calcifer. Now I don't know if Calcifer has a cute little booty, but we're going to give him one. So here I want it to be kind of a little apple-shaped bottom, and I'm going to add clay to just build that up a little bit. We're going to give this guy some cute little booty cheeks. I mean, that's hilarious and also adorable. Here I'm going to be using some Bacon Bond to attach our log fully to our Calcifer. This will make sure that they stay together and they don't break apart. So I'm putting a generous amount on the inside. Still looks like a Pac-Man, but we're just going to work through it. Now we're going to give our little Pac-Man a hat. I'm just kidding. This is going to be Calcifer's main flame on top of his head. So I'm just adding a little cone shape of that clay, pressing it in, and I figured out a fun way to make a flame shape is to twist the clay. So as I'm pulling up, I'm also twisting it, and it gives us this really cool twisted fire flame look. So I'm adding some triangles of clay and little fire shapes. And here you can see I cut it at a diagonal so it sticks to the body better without adding too much bulk. And then I go in using some tools to help blend everything together. Some of the spaces are a little tight, and that's where your tools can really help you out. I really love this tool set. I'll link it below. Not affiliated, I just like it. And here I'm just smoothing everything out, and you can see we have some nice little fire flame shapes going. Now I'm going to close up all of these gaps because I'm going to be casting this Calcifer so I can get different colors. And all of those little holes where the log connects to the body, those are going to cause me problems with air bubbles. Air bubbles are something you constantly deal with resin casting, and I know that this is going to make everything go much smoother. And I actually like the way it looks a lot better too. It's up to you whether you want to do this or not. Now our little guy needs some arms and legs. So here I'm just adding some arm shapes on. You can always add more clay later as you go. And here I am closing up those gaps again and getting nice little flame shapes for the arms. You want to make sure that face area is really flat so that we can get his face on there really nicely without a bunch of bumps. And here I am closing those gaps up a little bit more as well. This made casting so much easier. But those flames need some detailing, they're way too boring. So we're gonna add some swirls and shapes onto those. Now to make sure that these don't just look like boring lines drawn on there, you want to try to give your lines some dimension. Here you can see I'm moving the clay to make more of a V-shaped valley than just making a straight boring line. This gives the shapes a lot more movement and makes them look a lot more realistic. So here you can see I'm actually moving the clay around, not just drawing on top of it. So you can draw your line and then go back and shape that line out. It just adds so much more dimension. You can make sure to get in there and add all of those little details. Now you can see I have the larger details done, but I want to go back in and add some smaller ones. This still isn't detailed enough for me. So I'm using this tool to just create those valleys I was talking about. I use a combination of tools and techniques to just get really nice shapes. And now we're going to add on the legs. These were the shapes I decided I liked best. Now I'm just positioning them and figuring out what looks good. I'm realizing here that they are too small and I'm going to need to add more clay, but that's alright, we can always add more. Here you can see I'm just blending them really good into the body and filling in any of those pesky gaps I'm always talking about. Once you've been resin casting for a while, you figure out what's going to cause you issues and you try to fix it beforehand. That way you cry less. Here I'm just working out the details so I can separate the body and the legs. And look at that, you want some nice, plump little thighs. And you can add clay as you go, and you'll start to see what looks right as you add it. Here I realized I need to add a lot more clay, so I'm just working it in and smoothing it all out. And after that, I can start detailing the arms. Now once again, we're trying to create more dimension, so we're shaping these lines as we're adding them in and sculpting them, not just drawing flat lines. We want dimension and movement. You can see with this tool I can really get those nice shapes in. We're going to do that on the legs here too, and here you can see those valleys I'm talking about and the shapes we're trying to get. Regular lines are fine for some things, but for this we want way more dimension and movement in them. This is where your tools become very helpful. Take your time, and if you mess up, just smooth the clay out and try again. I'm going to use these circle clay cutters to punch out some perfect little eyeballs. Then I'm going to draw out the mouth and get it where I like it and where I think it looks good. And then I'll start pushing that tool in to kind of carve out where I want the mouth to be. I'm going to use my finger to smooth out the edges and get it looking really nice. Now here's what it looks like after all the sculpting. And we're going to put on some clay softener to smooth out any fingerprints, get rid of any big pieces of lint, and get them all nice and smooth. Once he's a super smooth boy with the smoothest bottom, it's time to bake. This time I'm going to be using an oven thermometer to make sure that my temperature is accurate. I recommend always using them. And here's what it looks like after baking and much sanding. I always recommend sanding your pieces, especially if you're going to mold them and do casts. Any imperfections on your model will show up in your casts if you don't make sure everything is as smooth as you can possibly get it. Now we're going to mold this little cutie. I'm using Mold Star 15 Slow. It's my favorite silicone. Pretty easy to use too. Here's my favorite part. We're going to drown that little bad boy. Then I'm going to use urethane to make some resin casts. That way I can paint them different colors and try out different effects. I'm curing my cast under pressure. This helps with bubbles. Let's see what our first cast looks like. If you do it right, you should have a perfect little replica. What I love about molding and casting is that I can use different resins to get different effects. Here I used a clear urethane so that I could get a nice transparent blue calcifer. For this one, I used some opal glitter flakes to get a cool effect. And here I'm using my prism technique to do a prism fire calcifer that I thought came out really cool. I have a YouTube video on how to get this effect. Here we did a little fire opal. Now casts usually don't come out perfect, Usually there's pore spouts and flashing that you need to cut off and sand. So here I am cutting off the pore spouts and some of the flashing, being very careful not to stab myself, which I've done a million times. Now here you can see we have some bubbles in our cast and we're going to fix them. I like to cut away any of the flimsy resin around the repair area, and then I like to score it with my X-Acto. This makes sure any material that I put inside will stick really nicely. You can use UV resin or epoxy sculpt. I'm sure there's other materials you can use, but those are the two I like to use. If the hole's very shallow, I like to make it a little deeper so that the repair can really sit in there nicely. Sometimes you can cut away that area and sand it. Here I am using some epoxy sculpt to fill that bubble. I just go ahead and re-sculpt it and retexture it, and you'd never know there were bubbles there to begin with. Now with a bigger area like this, you can see it's really glossy and shiny where the resin's dried. I like to score that up and then stick in my epoxy sculpt. This will make sure that it sticks really nicely and doesn't pop out. I'm going to use a sanding belt to sand the bottoms of these nice and flat. I want to make sure I'm sanding them even so that they're not coming out crooked and getting rid of any excess resin on the bottom. Make sure you hold on to it firmly or you will launch it. Example A, I do it every time, at least one. Now you can see the bottoms are nice and perfectly smooth, and they look so much nicer. And now all these little guys are going to need a little bath. Now after their baths, I can find any flashing areas that are uneven that I need to sand. Here I'm just taking some sandpaper and getting rid of the pore spout edges and any of those areas that needed to be sanded off. And then I go over my repair areas. Here I'm fixing the area that had a bubble that I cut off. Now I'm just sanding it smooth. And when you think you're done sanding, do a little bit more sanding. And here you can see after it's all sanded away, it looks really nice. Now these guys are ready for paint. Here I am trying out using some white primer before I paint. I'm still figuring out if I like that or not. I did realize it does not show up on camera, so this is a really useful shot. Here I'm going from a light blue to a darker blue. You can use whatever colors you like. I like using an airbrush because it really gives a nice gradient. I used a nice metallic blue and lightened up that face just a bit. Just wipe that off, you didn't see that. Here I'm going from a nice bright happy yellow, and then I'll work my way to the darker colors. And of course you gotta add a little red to those booty cheeks. And I'm gonna let you guys in on my secret ingredient, which is Dragonfly Glaze by Folk Art. You can use it a million ways, but I like to water it down, put it through my airbrush, and coat my pieces in it, and it gives it this very subtle sparkle. Now it's time to do the details. I found that the red really made the mouth stand out and looked really nice, and then I used a dark blue for the blue Calcifer. Then we're going to highlight all of those beautiful flame details with some gold paint. I'm using golden gold paint. Was I holding my breath during this? Yes, I was. If your paint feels too thick, go ahead and water it down. You can either use water or a flow improver, and that'll help you get nice, clean strokes. Just highlighting all those details. We didn't do all that work for nothing. And for the blue Calcifer, I went with silver lining. Get it? A silver lining? I had to, I'm sorry. You can play around with colors and use any color combos you'd like. A good set of detail brushes really helps when it comes to painting these small details. Don't worry if your lines aren't perfect, you can always wipe it off and try again. And always make sure you paint your crack. I also wanted to paint the details on the transparent calcifers, and it really made it pop. And now we gotta paint that log. I found it easiest to paint all around the calcifer figure and then paint the rest. That way I could do all the detailed edging and then do all the big stuff after. This brown paint was pretty thick, so I ended up watering it down a little bit and just doing multiple coats. I think in the end I ended up doing 3 full coats of the brown. And now it's time to do those whites of the eyes. And he's really starting to come together. He's looking a little dead inside though. We need some pupils badly. But first we need to add that second color to our log so it's not so boring. We're going to use a lighter color for the inside of the wood. The only way I could paint this was by doing the swirly swirl, and it worked. And then I went back and did all the detail painting. This is so satisfying. Now it's time to bring out all of those little cracks and crevices that we made. I tried painting a larger area and it just didn't look right, so I just went with the cracks and it really looked good. I just watered down some black and it was the perfect amount. It brought out the details but didn't distract from the overall piece. And now it's time for the eyes. I'm using a dotting tool here to get those perfect little pupils. And if you mess up like I did, I simply scraped it off and tried again. I'm going to use this matte finish by Krylon, and you can see that sparkle's really subtle, and it is so soft and smooth. But we want some glossy eyes, so I'm using some polyurethane to gloss them up. I like adding felt bottoms to the bottom of my pieces, it just finishes them off really nicely. So if you'd like to do that, I just make a little template of the bottom and trace it out on some felt. And then I cut it out with some scissors and use some matte Mod Podge to glue it on the bottom. I put a decent amount, but not too much, and just press the felt right in. And if you're a perfectionist like me, I like to take a paintbrush and just go around the edges real quick. And our little calcifer is done. I love how he turned out and all the colors I got to use and all the effects I got to try out on him. I'd love to know who your favorite Studio Ghibli character is in the comments. Thanks so much for watching.